Hi, this is David, Two Stroke Performance. Welcome to another TSP video. Today we're going to look at the installation process for one of our new injector relocation kits on a 250 and 300 TPI bike. Now this bike beside me is a 2020 model, but this video does apply to models from 2018 onwards up to the current 2023 TPI bikes. To start with, you'll see I've already removed the seat and the tank. I've already taken off the chassis mounts, which go from the chassis to the side of the head. I've taken them off on both sides for better access. I've removed the air filter, and I've also removed the complete exhaust system. Now, technically, you only need to remove the silencer, but I also took off the expansion chamber just for the purposes of this video to make it a little bit easier to see what we're doing. So let's get straight into the installation. The first thing that we need to do is lift the subframe. So we start off by loosening off the hose clamp on the rubber intake boot at the throttle body. So loosen it off until the hose clamp rotates easily around the intake boot, like that. The next thing we need to do is we need to remove the bottom bolts on the subframe, these ones here. So both sides of the bike, we're going to remove these bolts. And then coming up to the top, we're going to just loosen off the bolts at the top here, but leave them in place. So we'll do that now. So that one's removed, top one's loosened, but left in place. And to the other side, remove the bottom one and loosen the top one. Leave that in place. Now I'll go back around to the other side of the bike. And the next step is to lift the subframe. Now, in order to do that, often this rubber boot will stick quite firmly to the throttle body. Even though we've loosened off this hose clamp, sometimes you need to get a flat blade screwdriver in there and try and prise the rubber boot rearwards as you lift the subframe. So I'm going to do that now. You need to be careful. On this bike, I've got a metal TPS guard, which gives me something to lever against. On a stock bike with a plastic TPS guard, you need to be careful that you don't leverage too hard against that, because you can actually crack that plastic guard. So I'll get the flat blade in there, and as I'm lifting the subframe gently, just lever the rubber boot off. This one's a little bit stiff. There we go. Now I'm going to lift the subframe just a small way, not too far, because you don't want to stretch these electrical cables here. And then when it's in this upright position, I'm going to tighten the top bolts again. That just allows the subframe to stay in position while we're working on it. Now we need to remove the electrical connector to the intake air temperature sensor. So just push on the tab and lift the connector outwards. Sometimes that can be a little bit tricky to get out if it's never been removed before. And then behind that also, we need to remove the power valve breather hose. So just pull that off that aluminium barbed fitting there and tuck it out of the way for the moment. Now the next step is actually to remove the rubber boot from the airbox. You need to be a little bit rough with this sometimes. So I'm putting one hand around behind it, folding the top edge down while I'm pushing from behind. And a combined motion of pulling and rotating at the same time, you should be able to get the air boot out. So that's the complete air boot with the air temperature sensor still in place, the power valve breather fitting still in place, and obviously we've still got this hose clamp sitting here. We'll now take this to the bench, leave it on the bench, and we'll come back and we'll have a look at the injectors and the fuel rail in just a second. So the next step is to remove the injectors and the fuel rail. First thing we do is pull the rubber boot back and press up on the tab on the underside and remove the electrical connector. Then staying on this side of the bike, we're going to remove the two bolts that actually hold the injector in place. These are 8mm head bolts, so you'll need an 8mm socket. Remove them out of the way. Then you can gently lift the whole injector and fuel rail out of position. Just leave it there. For the moment, we'll go around to the other side of the bike and do the same thing. So again, remove the electrical connector, press up on the tab and pull backwards. Remove the 2 bolts. And pull upwards gently, and the injector will come out. Now I'll go back around to the other side and remove that assembly. So now you can lift this up and gently take it out of place. You'll see you've got both injectors there and the complete fuel rail. Now we'll take this over to the bench and we'll begin the process of reassembling everything, ready for reinstallation. So we're over at the bench now. We've got the air boot from the 20 model that we just removed. I've also got an air boot from an 18-19 model, which I'll talk about in a moment, just to explain one small difference. And we've got the injectors and the fuel rail. Plus we've got our Injector Relocation Kit, which I'm about to open now just to see what's inside. So if we open up the bag that the kit comes in, tip everything out on the bench. Put that to the side. So first of all, you'll see we have 2 lengths of fuel hose, a short length and a long length. We have 2 aluminium fittings, which are the injector mount. We have 1 Injector Blank with 2 O-rings already in place on it. We have 1 small rubber cap. We have hose clamps, and we have an adhesive gasket. So they're all the components that should be in the kit. Now the 18 and 19 kit will also have a small O-ring similar to that and a slightly different looking aluminium mount, but otherwise the kits are essentially the same. So now we need to prepare the air boot with the new injector. First part of the process is to remove the air temperature sensor. Now I'm using a T20 Torx bit to do that. I have to undo these coarse thread screws. I'll put them to the side because we will reuse those. Now you can gently pull out the air temperature sensor, and you'll notice there's a small rubber O-ring around the base of the air temperature sensor. Remove that O-ring and also put it to the side because we will reuse it later on as well. The next thing we need to do is we need to remove this aluminium barbed fitting. Now the simplest way to do that is either to get a small Allen key or a small screwdriver, pass it through the hole in the middle of the fitting, and basically bend it and rotate it to one side, and it will pop out of the rubber moulding. This one's actually coming out on the inside, which is okay. Sometimes they come out on the outside. So you see that starting to pop through there. Take it out by hand, and there we go. That's the aluminium fitting, and it's left a hole through the rubber air boot. Now, this is probably a good time to explain the difference between the 18-19 air boot and the 20 onwards air boot. So with the 20 onwards air boot, our air temperature sensor is going to sit in that hole. Now, when I place that temperature sensor in there, it's quite a firm fit, and that will seal quite well by itself. The hole is basically the perfect size for this round diameter on the air temperature sensor. However, on the 18 and 19 air boot, the hole is a fair bit bigger. So if I place the sensor inside there, it flaps around and there's a lot more movement. So this will never seal by itself. So one important step with the 18 and 19 kit is to take the O-ring that we supply, which is a 8mm ID by 2.5mm thickness O-ring. And if you can get a close-up of that, you'll see there's actually like a void on the inside. There's 2 layers, a front layer and a rear layer with a void on the inside. We want to place this O-ring inside that void. So it's a little bit tricky to do. Feed it in one side first. In fact, you can see that's almost going in. I'll just get a tool to push it into place so it's even all the way around. So if you can see, hopefully that O-ring now is sitting in that void, and it's actually making the hole smaller so that when we put our air temperature sensor back in, now it's a firm seal. So that's one important difference with the 1819 kit, is that you have to put that O-ring in place there before you proceed any further. The next part of our process is that we actually need to drill out this large hole in the center of that mount area there. I'm not sure if you can see in the video, but about 5 or 6 millimeters down into that hole, it actually restricts to a much smaller hole. And in order to get good flow of the fuel from the injector down into the intake, we need to drill out this hole so it's a uniform diameter all the way down. Now, the simplest and best way to do that is with an old drill bit. This one's a 9 millimeter drill bit. You can use the nearest imperial size. Really, anything between 8.5 and 9 millimeters will do the job fine. And you actually want to heat up this drill bit with a gas torch of some kind. And then once that drill bit is almost red hot, we're going to drill it. Now, I'll do that process in a moment, but I just want to explain quickly first. When you're drilling this hole, it's very important to make sure that you drill it in line with the existing hole, because the drill bit's going to be boiling hot and because it's going to melt the rubber away very quickly. If you come in on the wrong angle, it means that your hole is going to be on the wrong angle. So you need to just be very careful, get everything prepped, know the angle that you're going to use, heat up the drill bit, and then with the drill rotating, come in and drill out the hole, and it will go through in literally a matter of 1 or 2 seconds. So I'll do that now. I'll heat up the drill bit. I'm just going to rotate it a bit while I heat it up. You'll see it's got a bit of an old bent one. This one, I've used it before on a few other intake boots. That's why the end of it's already a bit blackened. I can see that's getting a bit of colour in it now, so that's very, very hot. Obviously, be careful doing this at home. You don't want to touch the end. Now, in one quick motion, I'm going to have the drill rotating, and I'm going to drill this out. And it's done. See, it's as quick as that. Now, the reason why we want the drill so hot is because it ends up with a much cleaner hole. If you try and drill it out without heating the drill bit up that much, you end up with a hole that's a lot messier, a lot more uneven, and has a lot more burrs and excess bits of rubber hanging out of it. So if you can zoom in on that, hopefully you'll see that's a fairly clean and straight hole. So while we're waiting for this to cool down a little bit, I'll put it to the side, and we're going to take our fuel rail with the injectors, and we're going to remove just the right injector. Now, these fuel hoses have L for left on the left side and R for right. We're going to remove the right side injector. There is a metal clip here, which you need to remove. It needs to be opened up and moved forwards. So I'll use a flat blade screwdriver to do that. It's quite easy. There we go. Now that that clip has been removed, we can remove the injector from the stock fuel rail. I'm going to remove the dust boot from the outside of the injector. And at this stage, I'm also going to remove the bottom O-ring. So there's 2 O-rings, one near the top of the injector, one near the bottom. I'm going to remove the bottom one because that is not needed in this process. So that's the injector, that's the O-ring removed. Now we can put this injector to the side, and it's ready to be mounted into position in a moment. So the next thing we need to do is put the air temperature sensor in position. Now, it is a smart idea to put a small amount of silicone around the end of the injector here, even though there is a very high chance that the air temperature sensor will seal by itself in that hole that we've created. I think it does make common sense to put a small amount of silicone around it as well, just to be extra careful. Put that into position there. Now you notice I've left it with the locking tab facing upwards. Leaving it in that position makes it a little bit easier to remove and refit the electrical connector. In a moment we'll position this properly once we get the injector mount in place. Now we take our injector mount and our injector and also the adhesive gasket, and we'll also take the small O-ring that we removed from the air temperature sensor in the earlier step. I'm going to use a small amount of 2-stroke oil just on this top injector so that it's slightly, on the top O-ring, so that it's slightly easier to press into position. Now, the way the injector sits here is that the top of the injector goes up inside here into this recess, and the base of the injector, this area here where we remove the O-ring from, mates up with this small tab here. Now, it can be a little bit, require a little bit of effort to push this injector into place, but if you position it and then push upwards on it, you should be able to get it into place. Sometimes it helps to rotate the injector a little bit. There we go, that's in position. It is quite firm. It is sometimes a little bit tricky to get them in, but if you persist, it will go in and it will seal very, very well on that top O-ring. So that's the injector now sitting in its mount. I don't know if you can zoom in and hopefully see that that little tab is now tucked into the recess where the O-ring used to sit. Can you see that? So that injector is in there nicely. It's free to rotate from one side to the other, and you'll feel it's quite firm in there. So that's in correctly. Next, we take the lower part of the injector mount, and it's got two sides to it. On the top side, you'll see this U-shaped recess, and on the bottom side, you'll see this area that protrudes. So this area that protrudes is the downwards face, and this U-shaped recess is the upwards or upright face. So these bits basically slide together. You can see this U-shaped recess will slide into the slot where the O-ring used to sit, and they should press together like that very, very neatly. If you have a look at the underside, the area where the protrusion was is now locked quite neatly, or mated quite neatly into the other part of the injector mount. Now we take our adhesive gasket and we peel off just one side of the adhesive. There we go. And then the side that we've just exposed the adhesive on, we want to stick onto this face here, obviously taking a fair bit of care to line up all of the holes correctly. The adhesive gasket is really designed to fill this void pretty much perfectly, so it should go into place quite easily and line it with everything quite well. Next, we want to take the O-ring that we removed from the air temperature sensor earlier. We want to place it over the end of the injector. Now be careful, if you turn this over, it will fall off. So once you place it in position, you need to keep this assembly facing upright like this until it's in position. Now next we want to remove the other side of the adhesive, like that. And then keeping this pointing upright so the O-ring doesn't fall away, we then need to mate it up to the air boot. Now you'll see that this part of the injector mount has two small things that protrude. Now they line up with the two bolt holes on the air temperature sensor. So without dropping this O-ring, I want to hook that underneath. Hopefully you can see that. Hook that underneath the air temperature sensor. And you see that's now aligned with the air temperature sensor. And I'm going to rotate the whole assembly around without losing the O-ring, so that the injector mount comes down onto this mount surface here. So we'll do that slowly. There we go. So a couple of things to note. You'll note that the aluminium injector mount has either side has come down either side of that rubber mount, so that's in position neatly. The air temperature sensor has lined up with the little tabs that were protruding forwards into the bolt holes for the air temperature sensor. I've got the locking tab for the air temperature sensor pointing upwards as opposed to downwards, because that makes fitting and removing the electrical plug on that a lot easier. And everything's sort of in position properly now. If I press down on that adhesive gasket will hold everything in place for the moment. Now what we need to do is get the two screws that we removed from the air temperature sensor earlier on, and we need to put those back in place in these two positions. So I'm not doing these up all the way just yet. I'm just bringing them down so they're just touching the surface of the aluminium injector mount. And what I'm going to do, I don't know if you can zoom in enough here, but hopefully you can see this, this adhesive gasket that we fitted in there has about 2 millimeters of thickness to it. Now, when you're doing up these bolts, you want to compress that adhesive gasket, but you don't want to totally flatten it. If you totally flatten it, there is a slightly higher risk that it will leak. So continue to do up those bolts until the adhesive gasket is compressed by roughly 50%. So it'll go from a thickness of about 2 millimeters down to about 1 millimeter. So that's probably enough there on that side. Hopefully you can see where that's compressed, and then I can come and do the same thing on the other side. Hopefully you can see that. Just have a quick look. Yeah, that one looks good too. Okay, so now that's everything mounted up. I now just rotate the electrical connector for the injector slightly forwards. This is roughly the position it's going to be in when it's mounted on the bike. That's everything done, ready to go. So you'll see the air temp sensor is now sticking forwards into the, sticking rearwards into the air boot. When the air filter's in place, that will be covered by the air filter. It's locked into position by the injector bracket, so that can't move anywhere, it can't rotate, and it can't pull backwards. The injector's quite firmly mounted, and everything's good to go. We have an update for some 2020 onwards injector relocation kits. What we have found just in the very early days of supplying these kits is that some bikes, so some linkage bikes and some PDS bikes with an aftermarket shock, unfortunately the outside edge of the sensor here will just touch on the shock when it's installed properly. Now, although there's no reliability sort of risk with this, obviously it's not the fitment that we would normally want for our products here at TSP. So if you find yourself either with a linkage bike or a PDS bike with an aftermarket shock, in order to be safe, if you have one of these current style brackets with the U-shape support underneath the sensor, there's a small modification that we would suggest, and I'll run through it now. So basically what you need to do, rather than having the sensor mounted horizontally like it is here, you need to change the sensor so it's actually mounted vertically, and then you need to grind just the outer edge off the bracket here to give enough clearance for the shock. Now I'll just install, actually I've got a separate bracket here. So you see on this bracket, I've already ground away just the outer edge down here. I've removed roughly half of the pin on the front side, but still left plenty of material to support the sensor. So I'll put this bracket on. I'll just give you one last look. So this is the current mount as we do it right now, and I'll put on the modified mount in just a sec. So here's the modified mount back in position. You can see I've now got this, I'll just try and get this in. There you go. Zoomed in. You can see I've got the sensor now mounted vertically in its position. It was horizontal before. And I've also ground off just the outer edge of the bracket here, just using a bench grinder. You can use a file. There's various things you can use. This is just aluminium, this material, so it does come away quite easily and quickly. It only takes a few minutes. So that is our suggested temporary solution for people that find themselves with one of these style injector mounts for the 2020 bikes. If you do find that the outer edge is touching the shock, we strongly suggest changing to this setup as soon as possible. As I said, this setup, if it does touch the shock, it won't necessarily cause any reliability issues, but obviously we don't want parts interfering with one another. So so this is our temporary solution. Now, what we will be doing for future customers, people who are yet to buy this kit, we will be redesigning this bracket immediately. So rather than being a U-shape support for this sensor, it will actually be a C-shape. So it will come from the top here and around to underneath, and it will mount the sensor vertically like this one is. So that will alleviate any fitment issues. Now, if you currently have an order for one of these kits with your local distributor, we're going to give you two options. One option is you can either wait until the new bracket is available, which will be around about mid to late January 2023, or we can supply this this standard bracket right now, and you can just go through the process of modification. So those people that are comfortable to modify the bracket can go ahead and fit this injector relocation kit right now. Those people that don't want to do that modification, which would be totally understandable for some people, can wait until the new bracket is available. So yeah, thanks for your understanding. As I said before, until we figure out precisely which bikes this affects, we want to just be extra safe, and so that's why we're saying any bikes with a linkage rear shock or any PDS bikes, so PDS shock bikes, but with an aftermarket shock. They're the ones that may be affected by this, so they're the ones that we're suggesting this change for. So now the next step is to prepare our fuel rail. So this is the original fuel rail as it came off the bike. We've already removed the right side injector. We're going to leave the left side injector in place on this mount. So what we need to do is we need to remove most of the existing hose clamps. So the only one that's going to remain is this bottom one down here near the quick release fuel fitting. So that hose clamp will stay as it is. The other 5, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, all need to be removed, and we need to pull apart all the various sections of hose. So we'll do that now. And just give me 1 second. Yeah.
Because that can still be seen in the background.
Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure I can actually do this, because these things are quite tricky to remove. Yeah, okay. So there are several ways to remove these original crimped hoses. One of the easiest ways I find is with a pair of cutters like this, obviously being careful not to injure yourself. You can hook one edge underneath the end of the clamp and basically rotate it up. There we go. So it's unhooked the end. We can open that up and remove it. So that's the removed original hose clamp. Now do that for the ones that were mentioned and strip down the entire fuel rail into its various components. Okay, so the bits, so once you've stripped down the original fuel rail, the pieces that we need from that are the curved piece with the quick release fitting still on the end. You'll note I've left the original hose clamp on that. You'll need the 2 bits of supplied hose that are in our kit, the short piece and the longer piece. You'll need the T connector, which was in the center of the original fuel rail. And you'll need the left side injector with the original plastic fitting, which was on top of it. So putting all of this together, starting with the left injector, I'm going to take the short piece of hose, put that over the top. Now, when I'm putting this together, the way that I normally do this on a bike is I'll do the hose clamps up just loosely. I'll do a test fit on the bike, make sure and just double check if I need to rotate the hoses at all, and then I'll do the hose clamps up the rest of the way. So for now, I'm just going to do these up loosely. Then the T-piece goes in the middle. With another hose clamp. To make sure, around this T-piece, you just need to make sure you set up the hose clamps so they don't interfere with one another. Then we have the longer piece of fuel hose that goes on the other end of the T. Then we take the angled piece with the quick release fuel fitting. And then last but not least, put one hose clamp in position on this end. This end, when it's all in place on the bike, will match up to the new injector mount. But we don't actually put that in place until the air boot is located back on the bike. Now, one thing to note, so that's essentially our final assembly. One thing to note, this angled piece here actually needs to be rotated backwards so that when it's positioned on the bike, the quick release fitting will almost be pointing down. The reason we do that is so that when it's connected up to the tank, it will actually bend upwards, and this curved bit of hose here will bend further upwards. If you have it pointing straight down and the quick release fitting forwards, it'll end up too close to the fuel tank. So this one actually needs to be rotated back a bit before you do up all of these hose clamps. But as I said, I would now take this to the bike, do a test fit, adjust all the rotation of the hoses to make sure everything is in position before doing up all of the hose clamps properly. So now we've got our air boot assembly with the injector installed and the air temp sensor in the new location, and we're now ready to put that back into the airbox. So one of the simplest ways to do this is to start with it basically upside down and feed the intake in first, and then rotate the assembly around while you hold it from the back side. While you're doing that, you want to get the edge or the lip here into position. It does take a bit of force to get this in place, and so just work slowly and carefully to get it into position. You also obviously want to make sure that you're not putting any sort of unnecessary force onto the injector or the air temp sensor. And I'm just working my way around, getting that lip into place. I've got one hand in behind the boot, working from the other side of the bike. There we go, that looks like it's good to me. Now, if you just go around the other side, you'll be able to zoom in from this angle up here. You should be able to see the lip all the way around the edge here is properly in position. So that's really the main thing you need to inspect, is that the lip is properly in position all the way around and there aren't any areas where it's folded back on itself. So once you're confident that the air boot is in place, we can then connect up the air temperature sensor. So we can take the plug for the air temperature sensor, which we removed earlier, and we can reconnect it. So if I can just move in there to see what I'm doing. There we go. So that should click when it goes in, and then you can slide the rubber boot all the way over so that the air temperature sensor is protected. Now we can rotate the subframe back down and align the end of the intake boot with the throttle body. So to do that, I'll have to loosen off those top bolts again. So we can slowly rotate the subframe back, making sure the air temperature sensor wire doesn't get in the way, and link up the intake boot with the end of the throttle body. Sometimes it needs a bit of encouragement to line up. There we go. That's pretty much in position. This is a good point to just have a look and inspect everything, make sure that the injector mount is sitting there, not touching the oil tank. As well, obviously make sure that the air temperature sensor plug is in a reasonable position. Sometimes you need to pull that loom around a little bit. Just make sure everything's sitting nicely and it's nothing's interfering with anything else on the bike. So assuming that all looks good, we can do up the hose clamp. There we go, that's done. We can also reinstall the subframe bolts, the lower ones. and tighten up the top ones. Now, personally, I normally add a bit of blue Loctite to those subframe bolts, but for this video, I'll just continue. Now, one of the next things to do is to connect up the correct injector wire onto the rear injector or onto the intake injector. So we've got our two injector plugs here. If you pull the cover back, you can see they actually have different color wires. One of them has an orange wire and a brown and white wire, and the other one has an orange wire as well with a black and white wire. Now, the black and white wire plug goes to the front injector in the standard location, and the brown and white wire plug goes to the intake injector. Sometimes you need to manipulate the loom up here near the frame. There is definitely enough length in these plugs to reach both the rear injector and the front injector, but sometimes the loom up here is sort of held captive, so you need to just manipulate this to get enough length in it. But you should be able to get the plug to the rear injector without having to pull it too tight. So I'm going to get the wire with the brown and the plug with the brown and white wire, and I'm going to connect that up to the rear injector now. You need to think carefully as well about the routing of things, whether they go in behind the clutch line. Make sure other wires are out of the way as well. There you go, so that's connected. I'm just sliding the rubber boot into place. I hope that you can see that on that video, but that's connected up quite neatly. You can see the wire here, it's not pulled too tight. There's enough length in it, it's loose enough. So I've got our fuel rail that we set up on the bench earlier. Now, I've left these hose clamps, they're on, so they're not falling off, but there's still some rotation in the hoses, so none of them are particularly tight. I'm going to set this up now just to get the final position, and then we'll tighten up all the hose clamps. Now, one important thing to notice, when I'm holding the fuel rail in this orientation, the hose at this end has the bolt facing upwards. The reason for that is when it goes into position in behind the frame rail here, we're going to come down with a screwdriver to tighten it. Doing it that way vertically makes the whole process that much easier, and it also eliminates the chance of this bolt interfering with the oil tank or with any of the wires. So first thing I'm going to do is slide, basically put this end of the fuel hose in behind here, and I'm going to mate it up with the fuel inlet on the injector holder. There you go, so that's slid into place. You can see that hose clamp has the bolt facing straight up. Now we can come back to the front injector. Now usually what I find, to get these things oriented correctly, there's a slight bend in the fuel rail, like back in towards the center that way. I'm actually going to reorient this behind the clutch line, like that. And push that into position. So there is a slight bend. If you were to look from above, there's a slight bend in the whole fuel line, slightly towards the center of the engine. But generally everything's in there quite neatly. Now, as I spoke about earlier on this quick release fuel hose and the T-piece here, you need to make sure that's actually bent backwards a bit, almost so the quick release fitting is not facing straight down, but mostly facing downwards, so that when it's all tightened up and in position, we can bring this up like that to join up with the fuel tank connector. So this is all looking pretty good. While it's sitting here, I'm going to start tightening some of these hose clamps. I'll do these right up. This one here, I can do up as well. Now, if you want, you can replace these supplied hose clamps with crimped hose clamps if you have the appropriate tool. However, you will need to maintain a removable hose clamp down at this end. simply because this is the clamp that needs to be undone anytime you want to raise or lower the subframe, or if you want to remove that injector. If you put a crimped a crimped hose clamp down this end, it makes the process of removal much harder. So what I'm going to do now is, now that I've got the setup of that fuel hose looking good, I'm going to remove it back off the bike. I'm just going to check all the hose clamps, make sure they're all done up tight, obviously with the exception of this end one, because that needs to be tightened when it's on the mount. There we go. So now I'll tighten these finally, make sure they're properly done up. Okay, now this fuel line will go back into position. Put the injector back in position in the front location. Now I'm going to get the 2 bolts for this injector and do these up. So that's our fuel line sitting there. I still haven't yet done this hose clamp up. What you need to make sure of is that the hose is obviously on this fitting a reasonable amount, obviously, so it will seal, but you don't want it pushing or pulling the injector mount too much. So just make sure that, when you wiggle a hose here, it doesn't move the injector mount, too much. That injector mount needs to stay perpendicular to the rubber intake. Generally speaking, you shouldn't need to adjust the hose lengths that we supply. And then I can come in from the top here and quite easily access this last hose clamp and tighten it right up. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see what I'm doing here. There you go, that's done up tightly. So now everything looks to be in position here. It all looks quite good. Now we need to get the second injector injector plug. You'll notice this one has an orange wire, as they both do, but this one for the front injector has a black and white wire as well. So that's the correct one for the front injector. So we'll plug that in and bring the rubber boot over. Now you may need to just adjust this hose clamp to get the right rotation on it so that the bolt doesn't interfere with this rubber boot, but there is plenty of room there for everything to go together without interfering too much with one another. So now the last thing we need to do is to go to the other side of the bike and fit the injector blank in the location where the right side injector used to sit. So as part of our kit, we have this injector blank, which has an O-ring at both ends. If for some reason this part does not have the O-rings in place, obviously make sure you put them in place at this stage. It's also good to put a small amount of 2-stroke oil on these before installation. I've already put some down in this hole, so it's ready to go. So basically the injector blank pops into position like that. You can then use this plastic fuel fitting which came off the original fuel rail. That sits down on top. You hear it sort of press into position. We then put the 2 bolts back in place. And then we take this 8mm rubber cap, and this goes over the end of the barbed fitting here, simply so that you don't get dirt or debris into this fuel rail, just purely so that it stays clean in the off chance that you decide to re-establish the stock injector setup. So that's basically the installation process. The next stage is to start the bike and just to double check that the intake injector is really only firing fuel into the engine when you open the throttle. So we've got the tank on. Again, I've got an ECU connected. First thing we're going to do is just a test of the fuel system to make sure it's holding pressure. If you just tap the start button, you'll hear that the fuel pump will spin just for a couple of seconds to build pressure. Do that 2 or 3 times. That will pressurize the fuel system. And if there are any leaks on any of the hose clamps that you've just installed, then they'll be visible straight away before you actually start the bike. So that's a good simple check to make sure that all the hose clamps are nice and tight. Now, once you're comfortable with that, we can start the bike. and we need to look down through the intake with the air filter off and make sure that at idle, the intake injector is either not working at all or only barely working. And what you should, if it's all connected up correctly, when you twist the throttle and give it some gas, then that intake injector should come alive and spray a lot of fuel, but only when you've got the throttle open. Now, if you've mixed up the wiring of the injectors, what you'll find is the moment that you start the bike, even at idle, this intake injector is going to be firing fuel the whole time. So anyway, I'll start the bike and then we'll snap to some video of the intake showing you how a correctly set up system should look at idle. So with the power valve breather hose that we removed from the back of the airbox earlier on, we're now going to cable tie that in behind this frame rail on the right hand side. I'm going to use 2 cable ties, one at the top here. You don't want to do them up too tight because you don't want to squash the hose. And then I'll do another one down here. Just making sure that the hose isn't touching the exhaust because you don't want to melt the end of it. So just something like that. So that wraps up the installation of the Injector Relocation Kit on our 2020 300 TPI that's on the stand here. So a couple of things to note with this kit. If you have also purchased one of our oil pump delete kits, now is a great time to install it as well. Obviously, just remember to run premix in your tank. We suggest 50-1 for most normal riding situations. And another important thing to note, even though you can use this Injector Relocation Kit on a whole range of bikes, whether they're stock or modified, we do strongly suggest that you use this kit with our own ECU tune to suit the Injector Relocation Kit. The reason is our ECU tune uses or phases the injectors very differently to any other tune on the market and very differently to any of the stock tunes. And so it's able to get the best performance, but also the best reliability out of this Injector Relocation Kit. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Happy riding. Thanks for watching.